He thought forcing her onto that stage would be the highlight of his evening. But in less than 60 seconds, the entire room would forget his name and remember hers forever. The grand hall of Whitmore Theater shimmered under layers of golden light, its crystal chandeliers casting reflections across polished marble floors that echoed softly beneath every step, and the audience, dressed in tailored suits, silk gowns, and quiet arrogance, sat waiting for a performance worthy of their expectations, unaware that what they were about to witness had nothing to do with the program printed neatly in their hands, and everything to do with a mistake one man was about to make. Claire Whitman moved quietly along the edge of the stage, her simple black uniform blending into the shadows as she adjusted a music stand with careful precision, her presence barely acknowledged by those who passed her, because to them she was invisible, just another staff member tasked with making perfection possible for others, her hair tied back neatly, her movements efficient, her eyes lowered not out of submission but out of habit, the kind built over years of being overlooked, and yet there was something about the way her fingers lingered on the polished wood of the violin resting nearby, a brief pause that no one noticed, not even the man whose voice suddenly cut through the backstage calm like a blade slicing silk. "Where is my instrument?" Victor Langley's tone carried across the room, sharp and impatient, his tailored navy suit fitting him like a second skin, his reputation preceding him long before he ever stepped onto a stage, and tonight was no different. His presence alone commanding attention as assistants rushed to meet his demands, their movements hurried, their voices hushed, because Victor Langley was not just a performer, he was a name, a brand, a man who believed that talent placed him above consequence, and as his eyes scanned the room, they landed, briefly, dismissively, on Claire, who stood just a few feet away holding the violin he had been searching for. "You," he said, not bothering to learn her name. "Hand it over." And Claire stepped forward without hesitation, offering the instrument with steady hands, her expression neutral, her voice soft when she spoke. It was just being tuned. But Victor barely listened, his attention already shifting, his irritation building as he tested the strings with a careless flick. "Tuned?" he scoffed, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Let's hope whoever touched it knew what they were doing. A few assistants exchanged glances, the faintest hint of discomfort passing between them, but no one spoke, no one ever did, because Victor Langley thrived in rooms where silence protected his ego, and tonight would be no exception. At least, that's what he believed, until his gaze returned to Claire, lingering just long enough for an idea to form, something cruel wrapped in the disguise of entertainment, and a slow smile spread across his face, the kind that never reached his eyes. "Actually," he said, turning toward the stage as murmurs from the audience began to rise, signaling the delay had not gone unnoticed. "Maybe we should give them a little pre-show amusement." And without waiting for approval, without considering consequence, he gestured toward Claire as if she were an object rather than a person. "Why don't you play a few notes?" he added casually, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw attention. "Show us how well you tuned it." The words landed lightly, almost playfully, but beneath them was something sharper, something intentional, and the small group around them fell into a sudden, uncomfortable quiet, because they understood what he was doing, even if they pretended not to, and Claire stood still for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the violin, her eyes lifting just enough to meet his for the first time, and in that brief exchange, something shifted, something so subtle it could have been missed entirely, but Victor didn't notice, because he was already turning toward the stage, already imagining the laughter, the easy applause, the harmless humiliation he believed would make him more memorable. "Come on," he called back over his shoulder, "it'll be fun." And the room, once again, chose silence, the kind that allows moments like this to happen, the kind that watches without intervening, the kind that would soon regret it, because what Victor Langley had just set in motion was not entertainment. It was a revelation waiting to unfold, and Claire Whitman, the quiet woman no one had truly seen, was about to step into a light that would change everything. Claire did not move immediately, and that pause, barely a second long, stretched in a way that made the air feel heavier, as if even the polished walls of Whitmore Theater were waiting to see what she would do next. Behind her, someone let out a quiet, nervous laugh, the kind people use when they are unsure whether they are witnessing a joke or the beginning of something uncomfortable. And Victor Langley, already halfway toward the stage lights, glanced back with mild impatience, expecting compliance the way he always did, because in his world, people like Claire did not refuse, they obeyed. They stayed small, they played their part, and the audience, unaware of the full exchange but sensing something unusual, began to murmur among themselves, their programs lowering slightly as curiosity replaced polite anticipation. Claire's fingers tightened just enough around the violin for the wood to press into her palm, and for a fleeting moment, her gaze dropped to the instrument, not as a prop, not as a burden, but as something familiar, something that carried weight far beyond the surface. And in that silence, memories brushed against her mind like distant echoes, concert halls larger than this one, lights brighter, expectations heavier, applause that once filled entire evenings, all of it compressed into a single breath she held and then released slowly. "Go on," Victor called again, louder now, his voice echoing faintly into the auditorium, drawing the attention of the front rows, where elegantly dressed guests began to turn toward the stage with growing interest, some smiling in anticipation of what they assumed would be harmless amusement, others raising their eyebrows with a hint of skepticism, because even among the privileged, there was always a line between entertainment and discomfort, and Victor was stepping closer to it with every passing second. Claire finally stepped forward, her shoes making the softest sound against the stage floor as she crossed into the light, and it was subtle at first, the way the brightness caught her features, revealing a calm that did not match the situation, a stillness that did not belong to someone about to be humiliated, and yet no one questioned it. Not yet, because the narrative had already been written in their minds, a simple woman, a forced performance, a moment meant to amuse rather than impress, and Victor, standing off to the side, now with a casual posture, folded his arms and watched with a faint smirk, confident in the outcome before it had even begun. The stage manager hesitated near the curtain, glancing between Claire and Victor as if searching for permission to intervene, but none came, and the orchestra members, seated just beyond the curtain line, exchanged uncertain looks, their instruments resting idle, their trained ears already attuned to the tension that hung in the air like a note waiting to be played. Claire reached the center of the stage and stopped, the vastness of the hall opening before her, rows upon rows of faces, strangers who had already decided who she was, what she could do, what she was worth, and for a moment, she simply stood there, the violin held at her side, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady, and the room, sensing something it could not quite name, began to quiet on its own, conversations fading, laughter dissolving into silence, until all that remained was the faint hum of anticipation. Victor tilted his head slightly, amused by the delay, and spoke again, his tone light, but edged with impatience. "Do not take too long. We do not have all night." A few scattered chuckles followed, but they sounded thinner now, less certain, as if even the audience could feel that something was shifting beneath the surface, something that did not align with the script they had expected. Claire lifted the violin slowly, the movement deliberate, unhurried, her chin resting against the instrument with a familiarity that went unnoticed by most, but did not escape the trained eyes watching from the wings, and her left hand settled along the neck, fingers poised with quiet precision, while her right hand raised the bow, hovering just above the strings, and in that suspended moment, time seemed to hold its breath, the distance between intention and action narrowing to a single point, and somewhere in the back rows, a man who had attended dozens of performances leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from casual interest to something sharper, something more attentive, because there was something in the way she held that instrument, something that did not belong to a beginner, something that did not belong to a joke. Victor, however, saw none of it, his focus fixed on the outcome he had already imagined, his confidence unshaken, his ego comfortably intact, because he believed this moment belonged to him, that he controlled the narrative, that he had orchestrated a harmless spectacle, and he had no idea that the silence spreading through the hall was not the prelude to laughter, but the first sign that everything was about to change. The bow touched the strings, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the entire hall had been pulled into a single suspended breath. And then, without warning, the first note emerged, not hesitant, not uncertain, but clear, controlled, and impossibly pure, cutting through the air with a precision that did not belong to chance or luck, but to mastery. And the effect was immediate, subtle at first, a slight shift in posture from those closest to the stage, a tightening of attention, a flicker of confusion where amusement had been expected, because this was not the sound of someone fumbling through a joke. This was the sound of intention, of years compressed into a single tone that resonated far beyond the instrument itself. Claire's expression did not change as she continued, her movements fluid, her fingers gliding along the strings with an ease that spoke of muscle memory rather than effort. Each transition seamless, each note placed exactly where it needed to be, and the melody began to unfold, not rushed, not forced, but deliberate, drawing the audience in before they even realized they were being pulled. And somewhere in the second row, a woman who had been whispering moments earlier fell completely silent, her eyes fixed on the stage, her lips parting slightly as recognition began to replace doubt. Victor's smirk lingered for a moment longer than it should have, held in place by disbelief rather than confidence, because what he was hearing did not align with what he had orchestrated, and yet he did not move, did not speak, as if acknowledging it too quickly would give it power. And so he stood there, arms still crossed, watching, waiting for the mistake that never came. The melody grew, expanding into something richer, more complex, the notes layering over one another with a confidence that filled the vast space of the hall. And Claire, still standing alone under the light, seemed to occupy more than just the stage, her presence extending outward, commanding attention without demanding it. And the audience responded in the only way they could, by surrendering to the sound, their earlier expectations dissolving. With each passing second, a man near the aisle leaned forward, his program slipping unnoticed from his lap to the floor, while a couple seated in the balcony exchanged a glance that said everything words could not, because they both understood what they were witnessing, even if they could not yet explain it. And the orchestra members behind the curtain, trained professionals who had spent years honing their craft, listened with a growing sense of disbelief, their eyes narrowing not in criticism, but in focus, because they recognized the technique, the control, the subtle choices that separated skill from artistry. And what Claire was demonstrating was not imitation, it was ownership. Victor shifted his weight slightly, the first crack in his composure, so small it might have gone unnoticed, but it was there, a hesitation, a question forming where certainty had once been. And his gaze sharpened as he tried to reconcile the woman he had dismissed with the performance unfolding before him. Because the two did not match, they could not match, and yet they did. Claire's bow moved with increasing confidence, her phrasing evolving, her interpretation revealing layers of emotion that transformed the piece into something personal, something lived rather than learned. And the hall responded in kind, the silence deepening, not empty, but full, charged with a kind of attention that could not be forced or manufactured, only earned. And as the melody reached a turning point, a subtle shift in tempo that required both precision and instinct, Claire did not hesitate. She moved through it effortlessly, as if the music itself were guiding her, as if this moment had been waiting for her rather. Then the other way around, Victor's arms slowly lowered, almost involuntarily, his posture changing as realization began to press against the edges of his confidence. And though he did not yet understand the full extent of what was happening, he could no longer deny it. This was no accident, no fluke, no temporary illusion. This was something real, something undeniable, and the audience, now completely still, no longer saw a simple woman on stage. They saw only the music, the performance, the undeniable truth unfolding before them. And in that moment, the narrative Victor had tried to control slipped quietly from his grasp, replaced by something far more powerful, something he had never intended to create, and could no longer stop. The melody did not merely continue, it evolved, rising with a quiet authority that transformed the atmosphere of the entire hall, each note building upon the last with a confidence that no longer asked for attention but commanded it. And Claire stood at the center of it all, her posture steady, her expression composed, as if she had stepped into a place that had always belonged to her. And for the first time since she had walked onto that stage, there was no trace of hesitation in her movements. Only precision, only intention, only truth expressed through sound. The audience, once restless and expectant of something light and forgettable, now sat completely still, their earlier assumptions dissolving into a kind of collective realization that settled over the room like a quiet revelation. And even those who had arrived with little appreciation for classical music found themselves drawn in, unable to look away, unable to dismiss what they were witnessing, because this was no longer about taste or preference. It was about excellence so undeniable that it demanded recognition. Victor Langley's confidence, once unshakable, began to fracture in ways he could not conceal, his eyes narrowing as he watched Claire with a growing intensity, searching for flaws, for imperfections, for anything that might restore his sense of control. But the performance offered him nothing of the sort. No misstep, no hesitation, no weakness to exploit. And the longer he stood there, the more apparent it became that the moment he had intended to own had slipped entirely beyond his reach. Behind the curtain, the orchestra members exchanged glances that carried a weight of understanding, their years of experience allowing them to recognize what the rest of the room was only beginning to grasp, that Claire was not simply talented, she was extraordinary, her phrasing revealing a depth of interpretation that could not be taught, only lived and won. Violinist, seated with her instrument resting quietly against her shoulder, felt a chill run through her as she listened, because there was something hauntingly familiar in the way Claire shaped each passage, something that echoed a name she had not heard spoken in years. The piece itself shifted again, moving into a passage that demanded both technical brilliance and emotional restraint, a balance that many performers struggled to achieve. But Claire navigated it effortlessly, her bow dancing across the strings with a fluidity that seemed almost unreal. And as the music swelled, filling every corner of the grand hall, the silence of the audience deepened into something profound, not empty, but full of awe, of recognition, of something that felt dangerously close to reverence. Victor took a step forward, almost without realizing it, as if proximity might somehow give him clarity, but instead, it only made the truth more undeniable. And for the first time that evening, he found himself without words, without the sharp remarks or casual dismissals that had always come so easily to him, because there was no language that could diminish what was happening, no clever comment that could reclaim the narrative he had lost. Claire's focus never wavered, her eyes fixed not on the audience, not on Victor, but somewhere beyond, as if she were playing not for them, but through them. And in that distinction lay the difference between performance and mastery, between someone seeking approval and someone expressing something far deeper. And as the piece approached its final movement, the energy in the room shifted once more, a quiet tension building, not from uncertainty, but from anticipation. Because even those unfamiliar with the structure of the music could sense that something significant was coming. A man in the balcony gripped the edge of his seat, his knuckles whitening as he leaned forward, while a woman in the front row pressed her hand lightly against her chest, her breath held without conscious thought. And throughout the hall, hundreds of people found themselves united in a single shared experience, their earlier differences, their judgments, their expectations all rendered irrelevant in the face of what Claire was creating. Victor's gaze flickered briefly to the audience, and what he saw there unsettled him more than the performance itself, because the admiration, the focus, the attention he had always commanded so effortlessly had shifted entirely, redirected towards someone he had dismissed without a second thought. And in that moment, he understood something he had never considered before. That control was not guaranteed, that reputation was not permanent, and that the very stage he had used to elevate himself could just as easily become the place where he was overshadowed. The music climbed toward its peak, each note carrying a weight that seemed to press against the very walls of the hall, and Claire, still calm, still composed, guided it forward with an ease that made the impossible look inevitable. And as the final sequence began to unfold, the room held its breath once more, not out of doubt, but out of reverence for what was about to be completed, because somewhere in the silence, the truth had already settled. This was no accident, no fleeting moment. This was a revelation, and nothing in that room would feel quite the same after it ended. The final movement did not arrive suddenly. It emerged with a quiet inevitability, as if every note before it had been leading to this single moment, and Claire guided it forward with absolute control, her bow pressing just enough against the strings to draw out a sound so full, so resonant, that it seemed to settle into the very structure of the hall itself, and the audience, already suspended in a fragile silence, felt the shift without needing to understand it, because something in the air had changed, something that demanded not just attention, but surrender. Her fingers moved with flawless precision, each transition seamless, each phrase carrying a weight that felt both deliberate and effortless. And there was no trace of the woman they had seen just minutes ago, no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the unmistakable presence of someone who belonged exactly where she stood, someone who was not performing for approval, but expressing something deeper, something that could not be interrupted or imitated. Victor Langley remained at the edge of the stage, no longer the center of anything, his posture stiff, his expression fixed in a way that revealed more than he intended, because the confidence that had once defined him had nowhere to hide. And for the first time in years, perhaps in his entire career, he was witnessing something he could not control, could not dismiss, could not overshadow. And the realization settled over him slowly but completely, like a truth he had no choice but to accept. The final passage approached with a quiet intensity, the kind that does not announce itself loudly, but builds beneath the surface, drawing every eye, every breath, into its orbit. And Claire did not rush it. She allowed it to unfold naturally, her movements measured, her timing exact. And as the last sequence began, the hall seemed to lean in. Every person present united in a single moment of anticipation, not for entertainment, but for completion. The final note rang out with a clarity that felt almost unreal, held just long enough to resonate through the space before fading into silence. And when it ended, there was no immediate reaction, no applause, no movement, only stillness, the kind that follows something too powerful to be processed instantly. And for several seconds, the entire hall remained suspended in that silence, as if breaking it too quickly would diminish what had just occurred. Claire lowered the violin slowly, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, and she did not look toward the audience, did not seek their reaction, because she did not need it. And that, more than anything, was what set her apart, the absence of expectation, the quiet certainty of someone who had already proven everything that needed to be proven. It was the sound of a single clap that broke the silence, sharp and clear from somewhere in the middle rows, followed by another, and then another, until the entire hall erupted into applause, not polite, not restrained, but overwhelming, rising to its feet as one, the sound echoing off the marble and glass with a force that could not be contained. And yet, even in that moment, there was a difference in the energy, because this was not admiration given lightly. This was recognition earned completely. Victor remained still as the applause surrounded him, his presence now secondary, almost irrelevant, and he glanced toward Claire, his eyes searching for something, perhaps an explanation, perhaps an acknowledgement, but she offered neither, her focus already shifting away, as if the moment had never belonged to him in the first place. Near the edge of the stage, one of the orchestra members stepped forward slightly, her expression filled with a mixture of disbelief and certainty, and she whispered a name under her breath, a name that had once carried weight in concert halls far beyond this one, a name that had disappeared years ago without explanation. And as that recognition spread quietly among those who understood, the meaning of what had just happened deepened even further. Claire turned to leave the stage with the same quiet composure she had carried when she arrived, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, and as she moved out of the light, the applause continued, following her even as she disappeared from view, because what she had done could not be undone, what she had revealed could not be forgotten, and the room, once filled with expectation and quiet judgment, now held something entirely different, something heavier, something honest. Victor Langley stood alone in that realization, the echo of applause surrounding him not as validation, but as contrast, and for the first time, the stage felt larger than he could command, the silence between the claps louder than any words he could speak. And in that moment, the truth settled fully into place, not announced, not explained, but undeniable, that respect had never belonged to appearance, and that the quietest presence in the room had just redefined everything. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, rolling through the hall in waves that refused to settle, as if the audience understood that what they had just witnessed could not be confined to a single moment. And even as Claire disappeared beyond the curtain, their eyes remained fixed on the empty space she had occupied, unwilling to let go of the presence she had left behind. Backstage, the atmosphere shifted just as dramatically. The same narrow corridors that had once held quiet dismissal, now filled with stunned silence. And those who had barely noticed her before stood frozen, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and realization. Because the woman who had passed them moments ago, as nothing more than part of the background, had just transformed into something they could not ignore. Claire walked calmly through it all, her pace unchanged, her posture steady, as if the thunder of applause echoing behind her belonged to someone else entirely. And when she reached the small corner where she had been working earlier, she placed the violin carefully back on its stand, her fingers lingering for a brief second before she let go, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for something that had just been completed. A voice broke the silence behind her, hesitant at first, almost uncertain of itself. "Claire, is that really you?" And she turned slightly, her expression composed as she met the gaze of the orchestra violinist who had spoken, a woman whose eyes now held recognition that had not been there before, recognition that carried years of memory, of performances, of a name that had once been spoken with admiration in places far beyond this theater. And Claire did not answer immediately, because the question itself carried more weight than a simple response could hold. The violinist took a step closer, her voice lowering as if the truth might echo too loudly if spoken openly. "Claire Whitman, you were with the New York Philharmonic. You." She stopped herself, as if saying it out loud might make it too real. And Claire offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, not confirming, not denying, but allowing the truth to settle in its own way. Across the stage, Victor Langley finally moved, his steps slower now, his confidence replaced by something far less certain. And as he approached the curtain, he paused, listening to the applause that still filled the hall, applause that no longer belonged to him. And for a moment, he seemed to hesitate, as if stepping forward might force him to confront something he was not ready to face, but the silence behind the curtain left him no choice. When he entered backstage, the shift in attention was immediate, not dramatic, not obvious, but unmistakable, because the focus that had once followed him so naturally now lingered elsewhere, and he noticed it. Of course he did, the absence of deference, the quiet distance in the way people looked at him. And then his eyes found Claire, standing exactly where she had always stood, calm, composed, unchanged, and yet everything about her was different. He stopped a few feet away, searching for the words that had always come so easily to him. But they did not arrive, not in the way he expected, because this was not a situation he could control with charm or authority, and the silence between them stretched just long enough to make it uncomfortable, just long enough to make it real. "That was unexpected," he said finally, the words falling flat even as he spoke them, stripped of the confidence they once carried. And Claire met his gaze without hostility, without triumph, simply steady, simply present. And in that moment, the imbalance that had defined their earlier exchange disappeared completely, replaced by something far more equal, far more honest. She did not respond with explanation, did not offer justification, because she did not need to, and that absence of defense said more than any words could have. And Victor, standing there with nothing left to diminish, nothing left to dismiss, found himself facing a reality he had never considered, that he had misjudged not just her ability, but her entire presence. And the weight of that realization settled quietly, without spectacle, without drama, but with a clarity that could not be ignored. Beyond the curtain, the applause began to soften, not because the moment had lost its impact, but because it had already done what it needed to do. And as the sound faded into a quieter hum, the truth remained, steady and undeniable, that the woman who had been treated as invisible had just become the most unforgettable part of the night, and that no introduction, no reputation, no carefully crafted image could replace what had been revealed in a single, unbroken performance, because in the end, It was not the stage that defined the artist, but the moment when the world was finally forced to see them clearly. The silence between Claire and Victor did not break with confrontation. It settled instead into something far more unsettling, a quiet recognition that words were no longer the most powerful force in the room, and Victor, who had built his reputation on commanding attention with every gesture and every phrase, now stood facing someone who had taken that power away without ever raising her voice, without ever needing to challenge him directly. The orchestra violinist who had spoken earlier remained nearby, her eyes moving between the two of them, as if witnessing a moment that extended far beyond personal tension, something that spoke to a deeper shift in the balance of respect and perception. And she was not alone, because others had begun to gather subtly, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the weight of what they had just experienced. The kind of moment that lingers in the air even after the sound has faded. Victor cleared his throat slightly, an almost reflexive gesture, and attempted to regain some measure of composure. "You could have said something," he remarked, though the statement lacked the authority it once might have carried, and Claire regarded him calmly, her expression unchanged, as if the suggestion itself held no urgency, no necessity. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, measured, and without accusation. There was nothing to say, and the simplicity of that response landed more heavily than any elaborate explanation could have, because it revealed a truth Victor had not considered, that her silence had not been weakness, but choice. The backstage lights hummed softly above them, casting long shadows across the narrow space. And in that quiet environment, every detail felt sharper, every glance more deliberate, and Victor's posture shifted again, the remnants of his earlier confidence continuing to dissolve under the weight of a reality he could not reshape. And for a moment, he seemed to search for something familiar to anchor himself to, a script, a role, a version of himself that still held control, but none of it fit anymore. "That performance," he began, pausing as if the words themselves required careful handling. "It was impressive." The compliment sounded almost foreign in his voice, stripped of its usual polish, and Claire inclined her head slightly, acknowledging it without accepting it as validation, because what had happened on that stage existed beyond approval, beyond praise, and that distinction, subtle as it was, widened the distance between them in a way Victor could feel, but not articulate. Behind them, the distant murmur of the audience began to shift, the applause fading into conversations, into speculation, into the kind of energy that follows something unexpected, and already, names were being spoken, questions asked, connections drawn, because the world outside that stage was beginning to catch up to what had just been revealed, and the quiet anonymity Claire had carried for so long was no longer intact. Not in the way it had been before. The orchestra violinist stepped closer again, her voice more certain now. "Why did you leave?" she asked softly, the question hanging in the air with a weight that suggested it had been asked before, perhaps by others, perhaps by Claire herself, and for the first time, something shifted in Claire's expression, not uncertainty, not regret, but a quiet acknowledgement of a past that did not need to be explained in full, and she answered simply, "Because I needed to." And though the words were few, they carried a depth that discouraged further questions. Because some stories are not meant to be unfolded in crowded spaces, not meant to be reduced to explanations that others can easily understand. Victor listened, his gaze fixed on Claire in a way that suggested he was seeing her for the first time, not as a background figure, not as a moment of amusement, but as something far more complex, far more significant. And in that realization, there was a subtle shift in his own presence, a quiet recalibration that did not erase what had happened, but acknowledged it, and perhaps, in some small way, learned from it. The stage manager appeared at the edge of the corridor, hesitant, uncertain how to address the situation that had unfolded, and after a brief pause, he spoke carefully. "They are asking if you would come back out." His eyes flickering toward Claire with a mixture of respect and uncertainty, as if unsure whether such a request was appropriate. And Claire considered it for a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of reflection, and then she shook her head gently. "No," she replied, her voice calm, her decision final, and the stage manager nodded, accepting it without question. because there was something in her tone that made it clear this was not a refusal born of fear, but of choice. Victor watched this exchange in silence, and as Claire turned to continue down the corridor, moving away from the stage, away from the attention that had finally found her, he remained where he was, not because he could not follow, but because he understood, perhaps for the first time, that some moments are not meant to be pursued. Some people are not meant to be defined by the roles others assign them. And as the distance between them grew, the lesson settled quietly into place, not spoken, not emphasized, but unmistakable, that true presence does not demand recognition. It reveals itself when the world least expects it, and when it does, it changes everything without asking for permission. Claire did not look back as she walked down the narrow corridor, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, each step carrying her further from the stage, from the applause, from the attention that had finally found her. And yet behind her, the energy of that moment refused to fade. It lingered in the air, in the whispered conversations that had begun to spread through the hall, in the way people leaned toward one another with a sense of urgency, repeating fragments of what they had just witnessed, trying to make sense of something that had disrupted their expectations so completely. Inside the auditorium, the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, the elegant composure of the audience replaced by a restless curiosity, and names began to surface, tentative at first, spoken as questions rather than statements. Did you hear that? Was that really her? It could not be, could it? And among those voices, a few carried certainty, the kind that comes not from speculation, but from recognition, because there are moments in life that cannot be mistaken, moments when truth reveals itself so clearly that denial becomes impossible. Victor Langley remained near the edge of the stage, his presence now overshadowed not by another performer, but by the absence of one. And he could feel it, the shift in attention, the way the audience no longer looked to him for direction, no longer waited for his next movement. And for the first time in his career, the silence he had once controlled now existed without him, independent, untouchable. And as he stepped forward into the light, there was applause, but it was different, polite, measured, a reflection of expectation rather than admiration, and he understood the difference immediately, even if no one said it aloud. Backstage, the corridor grew quieter as Claire continued toward the exit, the hum of distant voices fading with each step, replaced by the steady rhythm of her own breathing. And for a moment, she paused near a side door that led out into the cool night air, her hand resting lightly on the handle as she allowed herself a brief stillness, not to reflect on what had happened, but to acknowledge it in the simplest way possible, as something complete, something that did not need to be extended or explained. The door opened with a soft click, and the city beyond greeted her with its usual indifference, the distant sound of traffic, the glow of streetlights, the quiet movement of people who had no idea what had just unfolded inside the grand hall. Behind her, and she stepped outside without hesitation, blending into the world as easily as she had once blended into the background of the theater, her presence once again unnoticed, unremarkable, and entirely her own. Inside, however, the story was just beginning to take shape, because those who had recognized her were no longer content to remain silent. And the orchestra violinist who had spoken earlier found herself surrounded by others, their questions pressing in, their curiosity impossible to ignore. You said you knew her, someone insisted. Who is she? And the violinist hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of respect, because the name she was about to speak carried weight, history, and a kind of legacy that had not been mentioned in years. And when she finally answered, her voice was steady, but quiet. Claire Whitman. She was one of the best. The words spread quickly, passed from one person to another, gaining clarity with each repetition until the uncertainty that had filled the room began to settle into understanding. And with that understanding came a shift in perspective, a recognition that what they had witnessed was not an unexpected display of talent, but the return of something that had never truly disappeared. Victor heard the name as it moved through the crowd, felt it land with a weight that he could not ignore, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, because the truth had revealed itself fully now, leaving no room for interpretation, no space for denial. And when he opened them again, The stage before him looked different, not because it had changed, but because he had, his understanding reshaped by a single moment he had never intended to create. Outside, Claire walked along the quiet sidewalk, the sounds of the city blending into a familiar rhythm, and there was no trace of urgency in her steps, no need to escape or to linger, because she carried none of the weight that others were now trying to place upon her. She had not performed for recognition, had not stepped into the light seeking validation, and that was why she could leave it behind so easily, because for her, the moment had already served its purpose. And as she disappeared into the night, unseen by those who would soon be searching for her, the truth remained behind, echoing softly within the walls of the theater, a reminder that some of the most powerful revelations do not arrive with announcement or intention, but emerge quietly, in the space between expectation and reality, where everything can change without warning. By the time the lights inside Whitmore Theater dimmed and the final guest stepped out into the night, the story had already begun to take on a life of its own, carried in conversations that stretched far beyond the walls of that hall, retold with a mixture of awe and disbelief, each version adding its own layer of wonder, but none quite capturing the quiet precision of what had actually happened. Because moments like that resist simplification, they refuse to be reduced to something ordinary. And instead, they linger, growing in significance the more they are remembered. Victor Langley remained behind long after the audience had gone, standing alone on the stage that had once felt like an extension of himself. And as he looked out at the now empty seats, the silence that filled the space was different from before, no longer waiting to be shaped or controlled, but settled, complete, and in that stillness, he replayed the evening in his mind, not as a performance, but as a sequence of choices, each one leading to a conclusion he had never anticipated. And for the first time, he allowed himself to see it clearly, not as a moment stolen from him, but as a moment he had unknowingly revealed. Backstage, the staff moved more quietly than usual, their conversations softer, their expressions thoughtful, because something had shifted in the way they saw their own surroundings, the familiar routines now carrying a new awareness, a subtle understanding that the people who passed through those corridors each day might hold more than what appeared on the surface. And the orchestra violinist who had recognized Claire stood near the wings, her gaze distant, as if still listening to echoes that had not yet faded. And when someone asked her again if she was certain, she simply nodded. Because certainty did not need to be repeated, it only needed to be felt. Outside, the city continued without pause, unaware of the transformation that had taken place within a single evening, and Claire Whitman walked among it without drawing attention, her figure blending into the rhythm of passing lights and quiet footsteps. And there was no sign of triumph in her movement, no trace of the recognition that others were beginning to place upon her, because what had happened on that stage had not been a return, not in the way the world would define it. It had been a moment, complete in itself, requiring nothing more. She paused briefly at a street corner, the glow of a traffic signal reflecting faintly in her eyes, and for a second, the memory of the music surfaced again, not as something to hold on to, but as something already finished, already released, and she continued walking, her path unchanged, her purpose unspoken, because the meaning of that moment did not belong to her alone. It belonged to everyone who had witnessed it, everyone who had felt the shift from assumption to understanding. Back at the theater, Victor finally stepped away from the stage, his movements slower, more deliberate, as if each step carried a weight he had only just begun to recognize. And though nothing had been said, nothing formally acknowledged, the lesson had already settled into place, not as a reprimand, but as a quiet truth that could not be ignored, that the power he had relied on, the authority he had assumed, had limits he had never considered, and that beyond those limits existed something far greater, something that could not be commanded or diminished, only revealed. In the days that followed, the story would spread, growing beyond the boundaries of that single night, and Claire's name would reappear in places where it had once been spoken with admiration. But none of that would change what had already been established, because the true impact of that moment was not in the recognition that followed, but in the silence that preceded it. The instant when an entire room was forced to confront its own assumptions and see something real for the first time, and somewhere between The echo of a final note and the stillness that followed. The world had been reminded of something it often forgets, that greatness does not always announce itself, that it does not rely on appearance or expectation, and that sometimes the most powerful presence in the room is the one no one thought to notice, until it is too late to look away. And that night, without warning, without intention, dignity had stepped quietly into the light, and everything else had stepped aside.